And welcome, everybody. Welcome to this episode of FinServ Tech Oracles. I'm Johna Johnson, and this is not Jerry Murphy, but my oracular colleague, John Burke. And we're here to share our thoughts on technology for financial services firms. John, for this episode, you wanted to talk about NetSecOps and its impact on financial services firms. Let's start with a really basic question. What is NetSecOps?
It's one of those squish words which we're so happy to have in tech. And of course, it's about the convergence of security operations and network operations. And that can involve everything from just sharing tools to sharing staff to sharing an operations center and the staff and the tools within the operations center. Is it happening? Yes, mostly not yet. About third of organizations overall are using a converged NetSecOps operation. But among the most productive organizations in our research, the ones who are making more than $1 million a head, 75% of them have converged network and security operations. And 2/3 of the organizations that have been most successful in networking have converged network and security operations. There's still something we think folks should be looking, it is there for still something that we think folks should be looking at closely and working towards, even though only about a third of them are there yet.
And let me ask you just a question. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about this. How are you defining successful in networking?
Sure. Successful in networking is about how quickly you get to restore normal services once there's been some kind of disruption. And uh, that's the median time to normal across your outages in the year. What we saw this year for the first time was that the most successful group was dominated by people who had no unplanned outages on their network in the preceding year.
So networks are getting more robust. Yay. So that whole thing where you're trying to do a checkout at the supermarket and they're like, network's down, starting to go away. Got it.
Exactly, exactly. And, we have to hope this is one of the effects of SD-WAN becoming much more common out there because it's supposed to be one of the effects of SD-WAN.
Absolutely. So let's talk about a few success practices that financial services firms are applying, financial services firms in particular are applying when it comes to NetSecOps.
So one of the main things that we dug into on this one was the use of security frameworks. And NIST has one, MITRE has the attack and the defend frameworks, and we were interested in uh, how well adhered to those are out there in the world. And what we saw was that half of the financial services companies that we spoke to were using frameworks in security, sometimes multiple ones. One of them had 3 frameworks in place. Um, uh, Mostly MITRE. About half of the folks were using MITRE, and they're using it with a focus on incident response. Amongst the rest, NIST was pretty well represented. About a quarter of folks had sort of rolled their own based on NIST, but pulling things in from somewhere else or leaving things out that weren't appropriate for them. And
Uh,
I was just going to say, among other things, we saw that the folks who were uh, converged in this context, NetSecOps converged, had a lot less shadow IT in their organizations and therefore less accompanying risk there. So we look at that as sort of another success practice or another reason to think about convergence as a success practice.
Okay, and you had mentioned getting back to frameworks. You said that organizations and financial services firms in particular are using multiple frameworks, and we talked about MITRE and NIST. But I think you also mentioned when we talked about it that a number of folks are using self-defined frameworks. Is that something you're seeing as well?
Oh, absolutely. About a quarter of the folks in the group are using a self-defined framework, typically in conjunction with either NIST or MITRE as given.
And I'm raising that only because the financial services firms that I've personally worked with closely tend to do that. They tend to supplement or augment an existing framework with their own customization. I won't go so far as to say it's a success practice because we haven't been able to correlate it with something like better cybersecurity metrics or reduced shadow IT, but it's definitely what some of the most successful financial services firms are doing. Okay, so you've said basically success practices use a framework, use many frameworks. It, um, try to focus on convergence to have better reductions in shadow IT. Are there any other things you recommend?
Well, look pretty hard at converging network and security operations if you haven't yet. But as you consider how to do it and take steps towards doing it in your organization, pay extra attention to making sure it doesn't degrade your security. At the very least, it should be a net neutral change from your uh, risk and risk mitigation perspective. Ideally, it'll make things better for you, but at least you should, do no harm if you're going to consider this kind of change.
Okay, so John, it sounds like your top takeaways are number one, NetSecOps is not yet happening at the pace that everyone claims it is, but it is happening with about a third of organizations doing it. But it is definitely a success practice. It correlates to the most productive organization and the most successful in networking. So it's directionally the right way to move as long as you just said, you don't manage to impair your cybersecurity efforts while you're doing that convergence. Is that a fair summary of everything you've said?
Let me just throw in, it also seems to be a characteristic of highly productive companies.
Right. Yes, it is aligned with productivity, and highly productive companies are those that earn more than $1 million per employee. That's our definition. And it's always interesting to see what those guys are doing because believe those are the bellwethers of future organizations. And we can talk about that on a future episode. But with that, that's it for today. Please, thank you for watching and listening. Please do subscribe. You can subscribe to the entire series. This happens Tuesday mornings at 9 o'clock before the markets open. And we look forward to seeing you on an upcoming episode. Thanks.
Thanks, Johna.